Keep the Acid Horizon podcast ad-free by subscribing to our Patreon. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Many of you already know that a few years ago, I created a tarot deck called the Philosopher's Tarot. And around that time, I was introduced to a vast array of tarot decks and literature on the subject. And as I delved into that research, I encountered many rarities and oddities, some of which reflected approaches to tarot similar to my own. My goal was to create a miniature encyclopedia, a pocket archive of philosophy that was both fun and informative. And among these curiosities, there was one deck that stood out, but it was largely unavailable, or when it was, prohibitively expensive. That deck was Hexen 2.0 by Suzanne Treister, a tarot that maps out a veritable cartography of concepts and historical contours, blending cybernetics, conspiracy, counterculture, and the machinery of the control society into a tarot deck. It also highlights the antagonists of this machinery, including many philosophies familiar to us on this podcast. Just a few months ago, Adam, who's with us today, informed me that the deck was back in print, or at least it was about to be in the US. But I had to wait a couple of months to get it via mail order, but it finally arrived. And it is glorious! And equally exciting is that the creator of the deck, Suzanne Treister, has agreed to join us on this podcast today to discuss her creative journey in assembling this world into 78 tarot cards. But as I mentioned, Hexen 2.0 is much more than a divination deck. It comprises many circuits, and one might even call it a unique pedagogical occult artifact in its own right. In addition to discussing her inspiration and creative process, Suzanne will also talk to us about the sequel to Hexen 2.0, Hexen 5.0, which is currently in the works. Suzanne, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks. Hi.
So, Suzanne, let's talk about Hexen 2.0. Like I said, I saw this 2 years ago, and it was one of those things. It was going to be an insta-buy, but I think the only one that I could find online was used, and it was something like $100 or $120 at the time. And it just made me curious. This deck was so robust and so informative and tapped into many of the topics that we talk about here on the show. I was curious, what took you from an interest in cybernetics, counterculture, and so forth to creating this as a tarot deck? Can you just describe your journey there a little bit?
Okay, I think I started off actually Hexen 2.0. Well, it was because of my interest in cybernetics and how I researched quite a lot into what cybernetics really meant, because that kind of word cyber had been used kind of in like a pop way over the years. But I began to understand that cybernetics was a matter of feedback loops, which in order to make self-regulating systems. And I realized that Web 2.0 was actually a cybernetic feedback loop of control, because these self-regulating systems were about controlling things. So I actually started off making a series of historical diagrams. The tarot deck came later. I wanted to make these historical diagrams on like a big picture history, explaining that whole trajectory of the histories of technologies, the history of cybernetics, the history of computers, the history of the counterculture in relation to all of those things. I wanted to get together these 5 diagrams which described all these histories and the history of science fiction in relation to utopian and dystopian futures, and also a history of movements which were very kind of anti-technology, anti-civilization. I wanted to get together like a whole understanding of how all this thing had evolved and how we'd arrived at where we are today, in order to give people an opportunity to actually, through having that big picture understanding, to work out how to deal with where we are today and how to move forward away from, for example, at the time, the thing I was concerned about, away from control society, which seemed to be happening with Web 2.0. This was like in 2009 when I first started the project. So what happened is, about halfway through making those big diagrams, which took a lot of research and working out, I suddenly had the idea to make a tarot deck, because the tarot deck would allow people to interact with all the material. And so I basically extracted 78 key subjects from the 5 diagrams and connected each one of them with a particular tarot card. According to the Tarot of Marseille, I connected each subject with a possible interpretation from the Tarot of Marseille. So they kind of echoed a more classical tarot deck, but this was a tarot deck that could be used in a very political way by groups of people to discuss possible futures, rather than a tarot deck which would be for individuals to think about their own personal future.
Your deck, it investigates the participants of the Macy conferences that were held between 1946 and 1953. And there's also several other figures in the deck. For example, there's Aldous Huxley as the fool, Timothy Leary as the magician. What were the criteria by which you assigned these historical figures to the specific tarot archetypes? And maybe you can also talk about the centrality of the Macy conferences as a way of organizing the deck.
Yeah, okay. So when I was, as I said, originally I was investigating the history of cybernetics, and that's when I discovered the Macy conferences. So as you said, the Macy conferences took place between 1946 and 1953 in New York, and they had gathered together 30 both hard and soft scientists, so from anthropologists to computer engineers to psychiatrists even. And the reason that those people had been gathered together in New York was because they had all been, in their own work, been developing theories which were kind of like precursors to the idea of cybernetics. For example, Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, he'd been developing this theory of schismogenesis. Various other computer scientists had been developing ideas which were to do with feedback loops. And so they were brought together because it was considered that they together would all be able to develop this theory of cybernetics as a unified theory of the human mind in order to control it in the aftermath of fascism and the Second World War. So, as I just said, the idea being that in order to stop another Holocaust, another Second World War, it was seen that society needed to be controlled, and cybernetics was seen as a means of doing that. So out of these in this project, one section, which is not the tarot deck, is 30 individual portraits of the Macy conferences attendees, and with a photo of them on each piece, and underneath a text describing their own scientific ideas in the sense that one would understand why they were then invited to the conferences. And so, for example, one of these, who's also in one of the tarot cards, was Norbert Wiener, the mathematician. And it was his interpretation of cybernetics that really was incredibly interesting to me, because it was connected with this idea of the Second World War and control. And it's a very good way of explaining cybernetics to people who aren't necessarily aware of what it really means. So I'll do that now. So in the Second World War, Norbert Wiener was developing anti-aircraft missile technology. And so, for example, when you have an aeroplane and it wants to shoot a missile to hit another aeroplane, what he did was developed a feedback loop, a cybernetic feedback loop of all the information, which direction the plane is traveling in, and the speed of the missile, and the speed of the plane, the speed and direction the other plane, the target plane, is traveling in. Anyway, he got all that information together and fed it back into the missile so that when the missile shot, it would hit its target. And obviously a simple way of explaining the cybernetic feedback loop is through a central heating thermostat, where when the temperature goes up, the thermostat tells the boiler to go down, etc. So if I look at the cards, so there's Norbert Wiener, there's also John von Neumann, the computer scientist or polymath. He is the death card. He was a member of the Macy. He was a participant in the Macy conferences. Let's see. Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, they also have a card. They share the lover's card. Can you see any of the others?
You have Shannon for information theory. Lewis Mumford's in there. I don't know if was Mumford a participant in the Macy conferences, or was he just a historian of technology?
I don't think he was, no.
Obviously, Robert Oppenheimer.
No, not Robert Oppenheimer. No. So maybe there's only several from the Macy conferences in the cards, but they're all in one of the main diagrams. So there's one out of the 5 historical diagrams. One is called Hexen 2.0, Historical Diagrams from National Socialism via Cybernetics and the Macy Conferences to Neo-Totalitarianism.
There's also a Levin as well, Kurt Zadok Levin, who's also a Macy Conferences. He's the Knight of Pentacles.
Kurt Lewin. Yes, Kurt Lewin was really interesting to the project because he developed, I think he was still in Berlin, he developed this thing called the 3-step change process. And he went to MIT in America and via the Tavistock Institute in London. And then the Tavistock Institute in London and MIT co-published this paper of his. And so this 3-step change process was basically a kind of like brainwashing process or mind control process where you took the subject and you removed their original mindset and then you inserted somehow a new mindset and then you stabilized that mindset. A lot of these kind of things were basically initially quite positive things to try to help people after the Second World War, after people in the war shock, after the First World War, Second World War, post-traumatic stress disorder, was really a big thing. And then, so in terms of psychologists, they were trying to find ways to help those people. But then there's the possibility that all those types of processes are used, for the wrong reasons sometimes. And so I think the ideas of the Macy conferences the intentions were really good, but then a lot of those people went off and worked in the military and in technology and maybe produced technologies that were not so positive for society.
The contested legacy of cybernetics, as you said, it arises from this very sort of US government, very much a post-World War II milieu. And of course, people like John von Neumann, attached to the Manhattan Project, the creation of the atomic bomb, which is just so beautifully reflected in the back of the cards themselves. And in turn, but I also really appreciate there's almost like a counter-canon of cybernetics, or like possible political use of cybernetics that go beyond that in this deck. When not only when you talk about things like cyber war, in the titular sort of Ace of Swords card, and particularly like networks for revolutionaries. But this deck also contains I won't say a rogues gallery, depending on how one says it, sort of an anarcho-primitivist responses to that movement, to the movement of technologizing and making everything interpreting everything in terms of machinic diagrams, which also includes figures in the deck such as, the Hermit as Uncle Ted Kaczynski, Bob Black shows up, John Zerzan as well. What was it like in terms of creating this sort of canon of contrary figures to the cybernetics movement and how that informed the creative process of the deck?
Yeah, okay. So like I said, one of the diagrams I'll tell you the title. One of the original diagrams called From Diogenes of Sinope to Anarcho-Primitivism and the Unabomber via Science Fiction. So this diagram was actually trying to map out a history of people from the ancient Greeks and various individuals and movements who had argued against progress, against technology, against advancing civilization, and had other theories about how humanity should survive or develop or not develop. And this diagram showed on the other side a history of science fiction in relation to utopian and dystopian futures. And so this diagram involved a lot of research into both those histories. And it was in order for people, when they were looking at this big picture history in these 5 diagrams, to see all the kind of counter-arguments against advancing technologies and to be able to understand them and understand various different types of ideas. So from the anarcho-primitivists and John Zerzan, who feel we should go back to a Paleolithic moment, to maybe Jacques Ellul, the French anarchist, who in 1954 in his book The Technological Society warned against new technologies, and he wanted to explain to people that technology has within its own self, within its own system, its own inevitable development, and that human beings when they're developing technologies, they need to really take account of the fact that there will be an inevitable development within the technology itself, and they need to make sure that they're controlling that rather than letting the technology control its own development. So there was an awful lot of different positions. There was positions for people going back to the land, the whole countercultural movements. So it was in order to allow people to see through the diagrams and through the cards so many different possible futures in relation to the technologies, in relation to the anti-technologies, in relation to different outcomes of the counterculture, because the counterculture obviously didn't just stop, it evolved, and it evolved in different ways, some which were very pro-technology, like post-humanism and techno-Gaianism, and others which were much more going into Eastern religions or rewilding.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to think of also just making the link that Ted Kaczynski is a product of the Macy conferences to the extent that mind control, he was an acid casualty of MK Ultra. Not the connection to what he does afterwards, his other work, we're not too sure about, but there's definitely a lineage there. And also to say, another reason folks get this deck is I also love the lost futures there as well, because Gerard Winstanley shows up. And I think he's a great underrated figure in the kind of counter-canon of control society. But I just wanted to get that out there.
So I think it's important for us to understand the name of the deck, Hexen 2.0. And there's actually a very fun essay from Lars Bang Larsen from 2011 called The Secret Life of Control that comes with the deck, in which he talks about this concept of hexis as a sort of animating principle of bodies. And this also then ties in perhaps to some of the occult aspects of the deck. Could you describe what is meant by Hexen 2.0 and maybe address some of those other questions as well?
Okay, well, actually, there was a previous Hexen project, which I did in 2006, which was called Hexen 2.039. And so it all comes from when I was living in Berlin. I lived in Berlin between 2003 to 5. And during that time, I started making a project about witchcraft. And Germany has a lot of histories of witchcraft. And I found in the flea markets a lot of books which had this word Hexen on it, and they were all about witchcraft. So basically, Hexen is German for witches. And the Hexen 2.039 project was subtitled New Military Occult Technologies for Psychological Warfare. And through it, I researched a whole history of mind control, and in relation to histories of witchcraft, in relation to a whole load of other things to do with American film recording studios and Sam Goldwyn. It was a very broad research project, which was it was all based on real histories, but I made various connections for the sake of an imaginary kind of novelistic narrative. So, but after I finished that, when I was doing this project, this Hexen 2.0, I wanted to use the name because it had a connection to so much material in this previous project, and it felt like a stage 2. So, in a sense, this is like a new version of the Hexen 2.039, and Hexen 5.0 is almost number 3, actually. But Hexen 2.039 did not have a tarot deck.
I would actually like to talk about a few of the cards in the deck and maybe give folks a sense of how this is similar in some ways to the traditional Rider-Waite deck and maybe diverges completely from it. One card that stands out and is mentioned in the essay that comes with the deck is the Three of Swords, which, if you're listening to this and you've seen a Rider-Waite tarot deck, or I should say a Rider-Waite Smith tarot deck, it's one of the more iconic cards. It's a heart and it has 3 swords through it. And some of the dominant meanings of that particular card are things like betrayal, suffering, grief, and what have you. In Suzanne's deck, this card is MK Ultra. And I picked on this one because this is probably one of the sort of historical pieces more familiar to an abundance of listeners. And on it, Adam's showing it on the screen. And by the way, if you watch the YouTube version of this, once I publish this discussion, I'll probably do a very high quality flip through that you'll be able to see all of the cards in the deck. But anyway, if you're not watching on YouTube, I'll just describe the card. We have a huge banner. It says MK Ultra. We have stars. We have eyes. We have rays emanating from this diagram. In the middle, it says CIA Behavior Control Experiments, 1940s to 1974. And then there's just a kind of list of other terms like witch doctor study, ESP research, psychosurgery, brainwashing, psychometric drugs, and so on. I'm curious. Now, look, it's pretty easy for me to see the connection between MK Ultra and the Three of Swords based on what we have said. But why did you choose this particular card for the Three of Swords, maybe over any other card? Or maybe you could also describe the logic by which you made the assignments of these particular historical groups or these historical figures to various cards.
So I had a list of interpretations of the cards in the Tarot of Marseille. And what I did is I made a grid on 3 pieces of paper, and I drew squares for each card and named them. And then I got 78 Post-it notes, and I wrote out my 78 subjects on the 78 Post-it notes. And then I started placing them on the card that made the most sense, on the little square that made the most sense. And so at first it was quite easy to find the correspondences, and then it got harder. And then over the period of doing them, I was juggling some of them. I was making the ones that I was certain of, which card they were supposed to be. And then as time went on, I assigned other ones to other cards, and I sometimes swapped them, and sometimes I actually changed my idea for a card because I needed something that was going to fit in the remaining cards, in the remaining slots. And so somehow or other, MK Ultra fitted the Three of Swords.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty more interesting cards here. And this is actually a process that Adam and I know very well right now. And I think I mentioned this to you in our communication, Suzanne, but I created a Philosopher's Tarot deck. But also Adam and I, along with another friend who's associated with the podcast, we created a tarot deck we called it Acephalus. And it's basically the sort of world and cosmology of George Bataille. And we basically made assignments in a very similar manner, constantly reviewing like which card, which image, which concept goes best with the deck. And for those of you who are listening who supported that, we are well on our way to having that printed out and will be available later this year. But I don't know, I'm going to give it to Adam. I have plenty more cards I can ask about. Adam, are there any that stand out to you as being particularly awesome?
So, I mean, I discovered this deck. Well, I'd always seen pictures of it when we was doing Stuff Rubber, and then I suddenly walked into sort of our resident weird bookshop in Hackney. There's lots of them, and then just saw it and thought, "There's a copy of this guy doesn't know what he's got. This is going to be a steal." And I got it back home, and I was like, "Oh wait, no, this is a new edition." And I don't know, in terms of just this deck just kind of marinates everything I kind of like about, the contrast between, for example, like technological control and even steps towards mysticism and revolutionary apocalyptic kind of thought. I personally just really love the Five of Wands because it's William Blake, and it's rare that London has a prophet. I mean, it usually has prophets, but in terms of, for example, IBM as well as an underrated villain in history. I mean, personally, my favorite one is Drones, the Queen of Swords. I actually wanted to ask, as you was looking at sort of the history of cybernetics, as we get to sort of figures like the drone, and it develops a lot, how much do you see in this deck as sort of charting a history of control as well? Not just sort of compiling all the charting a history of these technologies. And I was wanted to, in a way, to lead this on to Hexen 2.0, because listeners, there is a new Hexen deck, and if you're in London, you can go to the Warburg Institute and see the revisions of loads of these cards. So how your relation to this idea of cybernetics and its history informed the deck, and also just how much it's changed that you thought, actually I want to develop this. I want to keep going. I want to do a Hexen 5.0. I want to drop a head 3 steps forward.
So, yes, in terms of mapping out these histories of control, yes, it was very much about that, and it's very much about trying to think through how to make a different pathway, to go back in time to a different earlier technology and then move forwards in a different way. And in a way, that's what Hexen 5.0 is kind of doing. It's going back to the idea of cybernetics and applying cybernetics to the planet. So when you want to control society, that's not necessarily great because it depends who is doing the controlling. But if you want to control the planet, which is kind of we've basically messed up. If you want to control it and make it self-regulate again, because it was self-regulating, it is of its own accord supposed to self-regulate. It's not like something that's been imposed on it by human beings. What we've done is unself-regulate it. And so in that sense, cybernetics can be seen as a really, really positive thing if we understand the planet as a whole system, because obviously cybernetics connects to systems theory. So if we understand the planet as a whole system in the way that James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis understood the planet as a whole Earth system, which is self-regulating, even he admitted that it had gone out of whack, that it was no longer able to do that. And so if we understand when we're trying to do something positive, like let's say planting a forest or rewilding an area or doing something that is going to try to reverse or help the problem of climate change, then we need to basically understand what we're doing in terms of a whole Earth system. Because if you do something in a vacuum without bringing to bear all the various disciplines together and an understanding of the whole planet, you can actually not help at all. So if you plant 1 million trees in an area which has been deforested, the planet will have, during that interim period, the planet will have moved on in its own way of dealing with it. And so you can't just go back. You can't just realize, you have to take into account what new species might be living there now that weren't there before, etc. So every single thing you do, you have to take into account the whole global picture. And so when I was making Hexen 5.0, I was kind of coming to this conclusion about cybernetics. I kind of felt like I'd invented a whole new kind of field which would take into this whole Earth in terms of cybernetics. And then I realized there was one which was called Earth System Science. And it's been going a few years. And I also realized that there had been a lot of convergent fields in the interim period between Hexen 2.0 and 5.0. Like, for example, spiritual ecology is a new field. Nexus thinking is a new field. And these are all really positive moves forward. Yeah.
I think one question that emerged for me while going through not only the deck, but the essay that comes with the deck, there's actually a sentence in that particular essay that makes a claim that I'm curious where you are at with that kind of claim today, given that the essay itself was written in 2011. And I just have a sort of paraphrase of it here, which is that with the onset of the age of cybernetics, and we could maybe even tack on to that, with the evolution of global capitalism, right? We're living in an age where we've completely evacuated the value of truth and morality. And now what we face is this kind of functionalist ontology. And Lars says that, it kind of makes us a little bit naughty or queasy to think about living in a world unmoored from a sense of truth or morals. And this is back in 2011. Now we're in the age of full-fledged AI and the horrors of its application in theaters of war, theaters of imperial domination. And I'm curious, it just made me think, that's probably a claim that I would want to adjust if I had written that in 2011. I guess my question is, has your politics, or at least your view of cybernetics, changed since originally creating Hexen 2.0 or starting these projects? For example, the introduction of Greta Thunberg to the deck. There's a kind of political choice there. And I'm curious to what extent any sort of shifts in your worldview have informed the changes that you've decided to make with the new deck.
Yeah, so like I was saying, because of my kind of reevaluation of the idea of cybernetics, I've adjusted my perspective in the sense that in these intervening years, climate change has become a much, much more central thing. So whereas 15 years ago I was concerned about government control and the internet, the climate change now actually becomes part of all those things, and climate change becomes another major concern along with government control. And government control is also the thing which is not helping climate change. So all these things have to be put into a whole system. And so whereas maybe it didn't come into my whole system before. Now it's quite clearly in the whole system, and because so many fields are crossing over between all those different politics, everything affects everything else, obviously. And so AI is a major new development. So let's say AI and quantum computing was in Hexen 2.0 as a card, but now again it's much more dominant, and it's going to have repercussions which are beyond imagining. And its escalation in the last year or two has been like unexpected for most people.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting as well that in the card that Greta Thunberg ends up sort of replacing or superseding rather than replacing is as I remember it is the Ace of Swords. It is the card that says, cyber war, net war, and it really seems like it's coming from like a previous generation of activism. Thinking about Occupy, Anonymous, which going back some time now, and on the card, for example, it says, terrorist networks, anonymous networks, network revolutionaries, hacktivists versus, so government cyber commands, info leaking, general ways of attacking using things like cyberspace and network theory on either side. When it comes sort of moving towards stuff like an ecological imagination, I wanted to ask, how has your sort of view of sort of the artistic imagination or imaginations of the future change between the two decks? Because one of the things I really found interesting as well was there's, all of the cybernetic imagination is all sort of drenched in futurism, and futurism, of course, can have a kind of a contentious meaning. So, if you can go to the Italians, for example, in the 30s and then get a kind of sort of fascist futurism when no one's allowed to eat pasta anymore, or what you've done in this deck, which is you've really taken in, for example, the works of like someone like Octavia E. Butler and sort of the general, and also the continuity of Afrofuturism as a new form, or sorry, a minor sort of now developing form of imagination. I just wanted to ask how that view sort of came about, sort of what you was reading in terms of Afrofuturism, and how you think it fits into a deck in terms of ways of telling stories about possible futures and in relation to problems we have today.
Oh, that's a lot of questions. So to get to start with the last one, so Hexen 2.0 had one clear thread of science fiction in relation to utopian and dystopian futures. And so then it had several threads through those 5 diagrams. So I followed all those threads through. So for example, now I have like how science fiction has changed in the last 15 years. So you have, for example, you have solar punk and hope punk, which are very, very different, and they weren't really quite around in the same way. And then you have all the futurisms. So there's not just Afrofuturism, there's a lot of futurisms. And I even have my own futurism, which is Kabbalistic futurism. And so all those futurisms are rethinking the future in terms of the past in different ways, which are really positive things, and which can also, they have quite strong connections to ideas of technology as well, and maybe using technologies in different ways, or looking at maybe negative ways that technologies are used and trying to change those. In terms of the card you were mentioning, which was the cyber war, that became, what did you say? I can't remember now.
It became Greta Thunberg, I believe.
Greta Thunberg. So, well, for example, some of those cards didn't necessarily have like an equivalent successor in Hexen 5.0. So, for example, a card that might have gone there may be somewhere else. And for example, there's now in Hexen 5.0 a card called Post-Truth, which has a lot of the current politics of post-truth, which obviously relate to AI and the future of technology and society. So all these threads are continued in Hexen 5.0 in slightly different ways, like they've evolved, because it's amazing how much has changed. It's amazing how much has changed since 2009 when I started Hexen 2.0.
One of the things that I want to know is how to use this deck. I mean, I know how to do a classic Celtic Cross tarot reading with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but do you have a specific spread or a specific methodology, or is there a way in which you want to see people use this deck in particular? Like for me, one way I know that I can use it is just as a kind of mini encyclopedia. I could just be sitting down with my coffee one afternoon, pull out a card, and I could look at, I don't know who Tim Berners-Lee is. This is a great time to go on Wikipedia, take a quick search, or find a book online or something like that.
So yeah, I think I've been doing a residency in Paris the past 6 months. And there's been a lot of visitors, a lot of different people visiting my studio. And so each time we've actually done a group reading, because they've come in groups. And I haven't really done much of that before, except in very institutionalized settings. But so we really got on a roll. So basically, I was laying out the 5 cards, and the first card on the left would be the current situation that we're aware of. But first, we would ask a big question, but it has to be a very, very big, broad question, like the future of humanity, the future of the planet, the future of the climate, the future of Donald Trump, Elon Musk, for example. Quite a big question. And so the first card on the left would be the current situation we're aware of. The next one, the one on the far right, would be the current situation that we're unconscious of. The one in the middle would be either, I did 2 versions. One would be actually the current situation, or could also be the obstacle. And the one at the bottom would be part of the solution, and the one at the top would be possible solution or possible future. And as a group, we'd turn over the cards one by one and discuss that card and discuss the contents of that card and how it related to, let's say, whatever you were talking about, the current situation or the one you were unconscious. And then as we got through opening the cards, the discussion would get more and more involved and much more cross-referential. And people were coming up with all kinds of analyses and interpretations and different ways of seeing the subjects of the cards than they might have imagined, and different ways of reading them in terms of the other subjects than the other ways than they might have imagined connecting them. And then when we've come to the final card, which is the possible future or the solution, it's like a very tense moment, because if it's bad, you're going to have to analyze it really hard to work out how you could actually move on in a positive way from there. Obviously, you can just lay them all out again. But each time each time it's brought up, it's allowed a discussion which could never have been had otherwise. Literally could never have been had otherwise, and which in some people I can see their eyes kind of illuminating, and they're going to go off and they're going to move forward in a more interesting, positive way, hopefully.
We have about 15 minutes until we get to the hour. Could we do some sort of virtual reading? Adam, is your deck shuffled right now?
Yeah, I spent. Yeah, I was going to try and do a reading actually before we started, but I wasn't quite sure how, so I did pre-shuffle it.
Is that okay with you, Susie, if we try something like that?
Yeah. Do you want to do it with Hexen 5.0 or 2?
Well, we have the 2 in hand.
Oh, I'd love a copy of 5 if 5.1 is going. But okay, first cards. We have the Knave of Swords, Interplanetary Internet.
So the Knave of Swords, the Interplanetary Internet.
It looks like essentially a kind of a set of Sephiroth forming the solar system.
Okay. And so this particular card would basically identify the situation or kind of set the paradigm for how we're to think through a problem.
Have you laid them out? But you mustn't look at them yet. We'll turn them up one by one.
Okay.
I'm going to lay out the cards. It's 4 cards, right?
5. So put out that one that you started in, because you have to put that one on the left and then make a cross, yeah?
Okay, got it. Laptop isn't big enough. Okay, yep, done.
So now pick up your first one on the left, which is the Interplanetary Internet.
Mm-hmm. Right. There we go. First card, Interplanetary Internet on the left.
And so explain again, Susie, now that particular card on the left, this is the sort of core situation, the paradigm. This begins the paradigm through which we're going to think through a problem.
So this card is supposed to represent the current situation as that we're conscious of, that we understand.
Okay.
So how would you relate the idea of the interplanetary internet, which is a thing been invented by Vinton G. Cerf, who was the original CEO of Google? 12 years ago, there was some node between Mars and somewhere else. So how do you see that in relation to the situation that we understand at the moment?
I mean, I personally see it as mostly due to the interplanetary aspirations of the current techno-capitalist classes. So Musk wants to go to Mars, Field believes in Russian cosmism, so he wants to colonize everything that moves. It kind of reminds me of sort of the interplanetary ambitions of our current, let's say, techno-fascist ruling class.
Yeah, the one thing that comes up for me is I've always put in a kind of funny twist on a line that we see in the beginning of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is to remain true to the earth. These techno-optimists, that's putting it lightly, techno-fascists, they want us to believe in these new gods. I mean, that's even the way that Elon talks about AI, is that perhaps it's going to produce a new kind of god under which we will all be subjugated. And I think this is an idea that we should firmly resist. So I'm very skeptical about the implementation or the further articulation of an interplanetary internet. But so what's the next card then, Adam? Or we go to the top one, right?
Then go to the one on the far right.
On the far right.
We go to the far right.
So that's the one that the situation that we're maybe unconscious of.
Okay, this is the Nine of Swords, which is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. The Tavistock Clinic, founded by a psychiatrist. I believe R.D. Laing actually used to teach there for a little bit when he published his book Self and Others, and I think also The Divided Self. Also, it's Kurt Lewin, UK Central and Local Government. So in terms of what we're unconscious of is probably the history of psychological interactions that are built into the systems we're using even now. I mean, the industrial psychology behind social media, the industrial psychology behind, say, the design of supermarkets, the panoptic aspect of constant surveillance, especially in a city like London. I would say that's the sort of the political unconscious of the situation, at least I'm in.
The one thing that comes up for me right away, talking about R.D. Laing and the divided self, is the notion of ontological insecurity too. So if we contrast that with the notion of an interplanetary internet, well, I think the speed and pace at which we're dispersing and disseminating our technological growth here on this planet is provoking a pretty intense state of ontological insecurity.
So we have three left, the top, center, and...
So if you start now, you go to the middle one.
Right.
That's the current situation as it is.
This is the Seven of Swords, the cybernetic seance. It's by men around the table doing during the Macy conferences.
These are the Macy conference participants, the attendees.
And we're still living in their world insofar as we're guided by, or guarded, technically, by nuclear weapons, and insofar as the military-industrial complex that allowed Wiener to do his research still bloody exists. I mean, hell. And if you want a book on how cybernetic society still exists, you can check out our book, Anti-Oculus, and my book, The New Flesh. But that's enough plugging.
Well, yeah, I mean, just the idea of a coterie comes up for me, but maybe we'll just, in the interest of expediency, go to, there's one or two more cards left?
There's two left. There's one at the top and one at the bottom.
So the bottom, if you pick up the bottom one, is part of the solution.
Part of the solution. We have the Eight of Swords, the United States Cyber Command, also known as US Cybercom from Fort Meade, which is, at this rate, given the power of techno-capitalists, if the US military do want to take care of the Elon problem or the Peter Thiel problem for us, they probably won't, because Palantir and Anduril have way too many US contracts. But I don't know, maybe at this point, maybe a dissident might be one of the few things that could save us. Oh God, no. And then, Craig?
Well, I'll just ask before we go to the last one, what if something kind of particularly unsavory or counterintuitive comes up in a space like the solution? How do you proceed with that, Susie?
Well, I was saying before, you have to really think it through in a way that, how can you see that as maybe something it might be something that you need to go against. Maybe. It doesn't have to be the actual future itself, but it's something that you're going to have to maybe, let's see what it is.
And this is the last card, top of the cross. We have, the 10 of Swords. That is DARPA, the US Defense Advanced Research Agency, contractor for usually in the form of Raytheon, and Star Wars do actually make a lot of virtual online games. And so in terms of DARPA's an interesting one, because it is just it's one of those corporations like the RAND Corporation, the Research and Development Corporation, where you kind of see them everywhere. I mean, I don't think it's not that there is a conspiracy that there are everywhere. It's just that they're just very good at what they do in terms of getting contracts. And in terms of the entire infrastructure of this, I mean, damn, yeah, I think, this is what we've tried to do in our work, Craig, trying to give a history, to seemingly give a history like this of these systems of control. And even where ultimately, they as they develop their histories, habituate them to developing new techniques. They learn through feedback processes. Maybe I'm accidentally reading this as an advertisement for both this deck on our own books, but these are bloody good tools to think through them.
I mean, the thing that comes up for me just in general, without having a 45-minute long conversation, thinking about the cross, on one axis, we have what appears to me like the techno-optimist axis, the will to colonize all aspects of outer space, to send our internet to other planets. And on the vertical axis, we have government agencies, those offering contracts to, those who are attempting to promulgate these technologies. And I mean, my first instinct is to say, like, if we were to have a discussion, maybe we want to think about how the corporate or capital interests tie into those governmental apparatuses which do provide contracts, or maybe just talk about the problem from the standpoint of how is it that these tech oligarchs get contracts, for example. Would that be a sort of favorable way to proceed in this kind of discussion? And maybe that would instigate us to like do some research or something like that, or develop some activism around that.
Some education.
Some education, anyway.
I think basically what we're looking at is mostly the problem. And so this is like putting in front of your nose, this problem has to be dealt with. The way forward is to deal with those mega structures.
That's great. Adam, do you have anything? I think we'll kind of move towards wrapping up, I suppose.
No, in terms of wrapping up, actually, I just wanted to want to highlight again for listeners that if you go down to the Warburg Institute in London, you can see side-by-sides of some of the older and the newer Hexen 2.0 and 5.0 tarot cards. And I know, Susie, you'll also be doing some talks at the exhibition coming up soon. I think you're doing something with Strange Attractor, is it?
Well, me and Mark Pilkington from Strange Attractor, we did do a reading at the opening, which was last month. But I think it's the 1st or 2nd of April, I'm doing a talk there.
Perfect. We'll have a link for that down below. And also, are you working on anything else in this realm of cybernetics, or anything else generally? Where can people find your work?
So Hexen 5.0 is already on my website. I'm going to be showing it in London at a gallery called Annalie Judah Fine Art, and the show opens on the 21st of March. And then in terms of the deck's published, the Hexen 2.0 has been republished by Cosmogenesis, and the website is cosmogenesis.world, not to confuse it with another Cosmogenesis. And in October, Cosmogenesis are going to publish Hexen 5.0. So I've just finished Hexen 5.0, so I'm trying to take a bit of a break, but I'm doing some very small scale projects. But essentially, I'm not going to start a big one for a bit.
Well deserved.
Well, I guess one last question is, here I am sitting on the other side of the pond and all this fun stuff is happening in the UK. Do you have any plans to come to the United States with this deck?
So yes, in fact, quite possibly in early spring next year, I'm going to be showing both decks as an exhibition at the Grey Area in San Francisco. And I'll probably be coming over and doing some group readings. And there'll also be the launch of Hexen 5.0 deck.
Well, that sounds amazing. And that will be a time we need to go out to San Francisco, everybody. Susie, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I've been thinking about this deck for a long time. And please go out and grab Hexen 2.0 Tarot. It's a lot of fun. It's educational. This is the kind of tool that provokes a kind of solidarity amongst fellow learners and activists and so forth. So go ahead and grab it. It's an amazing piece of work. Thanks again, Susie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.